Hi there, everyone. So for step one, we're going to talk now about AT assessments. And really what I want to focus on is why an AT assessment. So as you read in the content posted on Blackboard, there is a very individual and unique definition of assistive technology assessment, really focusing on the individualized nature, meeting the student where they are, looking at all of the different environments in which the student is functioning and the tasks that they need to complete, in addition to looking at everyone else's input there. As we saw in the SET framework, kind of looking at what are the different service providers, who are the people the student is interacting with throughout their school day. So an AT assessment would really be recommended when we see a lack of academic progress. And what I always really emphasize for teams is to identify what's the area that the student is really having difficulty with. If there's a specific goal or objective that the team is really frustrated on or is trying every trick in the book and can't figure out how to get the student to make progress, that's when an AT assessment would come in. I try to avoid the referral questions where the teams ask, what assistive technology would be helpful in reading? Because it's so open-ended. There's a lot of different places you could go. And when we look at the legal definition, so we want to increase the function for a particular student and increase their progress. So we need a starting point. We need to establish a baseline. So that's where, if there's an area of concern, that's how we establish our baseline. So you'll see in your implementation and trial project, you want to have a current functioning for their student and an error analysis. So when we're talking about writing, what is their typical spelling accuracy at this point in time? Let's get a baseline so that we can know if the assistive technology is making an improvement or kind of making things status quo. So an AT assessment could also be recommended if the team has a concern. So maybe we have a parental concern, or we have a concern from an occupational therapist or another regular ed teacher that the student isn't performing up to his or her potential. So that's really where an AT assessment could come in. Now, an outside assistive technology specialist may come in if the team feels like they don't have the knowledge to fulfill an AT assessment. If they're not really sure the technology available, and they can call in a third party, an AT specialist, which is the model that we have here in Connecticut, in order to conduct the AT assessment. But the question really is, where do we start in this process of an AT assessment? If we've decided that a student needs one, where do we start? So as we talked about last week in class, we really want to focus on this SET framework, everything coming back to what are the possible concerns that we have about the student. Tell me a little bit about the student, their likes, their dislikes, their functioning in other classes, in general, the information about them, the environments in which they're functioning. So this is where we would say, are they switching classes? Are they in a class all day? Do they have occupational therapy, speech therapy? The tasks that they need to complete related to the assistive technology assessment. So as I talked about with writing, do they have short written responses in social studies? Do they have to add labels to their math word problems? So really looking at where writing comes and the writing tasks across the day. And then finally, we're looking at the tools that the student is currently using. So this particular portion, as we talked about with the SET framework last week, can be divided up into two areas: the tools that they're currently using, and then some ideas for the tools that we could try out. So conducting a SET framework on your student that you pick for your assistive technology implementation and trial is really important, because then we can see this is where we're starting, and you're filling out a lot of the aspects of the rubric as well through the SET framework. And that really helps to indicate what tools should we use for your trial, and filling out your student column well will help figure out what unit of measurement are we going to use in order to determine that the tool is being successful. So when we're thinking about the SET framework, this is really a timeline or a flow of an assistive technology assessment that I would do. So the first thing right off the bat is I want to conduct an observation, and I want to look at the student across a variety of developmental areas and environments. So to keep in my example of writing, I want the I want to observe the student in more than just writing class, because I want to be able to see, is there maybe a concern about writing in reading class? Is the student maybe getting some supports in other areas that are masking this writing weakness that the student might have? And then what I want to do is I want to conduct interviews. So I want to interview the parents, the teacher, the student, paraprofessionals, any related service providers, and look at what are the tasks that the student is performing for you, or what are the expectations, and how is the student doing with what supports. What I also want to do is, in my initial sessions, I want to talk and interview the student, but I want to build a rapport, because usually an assistive technology assessment is focusing on a weakness for a student. So I do want to make sure that the student feels comfortable during the assessment, because you're really going to be targeting an area that the student might be a little self-conscious. I also want to figure out likes and dislikes. If I'm going to create any activities to determine if a tool would be appropriate, I want them to be highly motivating so that the student will play around with them and interact appropriately. Then what I want to do is, after I have a rapport, I want to look at the target area of concern. I want to gather some data on the student's current functioning, so then I can match and identify tools with features that I think would be helpful for the student. I'm going to create an activity to introduce the tools, and that will most likely be in a separate environment. For most older students, I try and target an activity that is meaningful for them. When we introduce the tools, what I really like to do is to start with the least restrictive environment first. So look at, what does the school already have in place? Do they have Chromebooks that every student is using? And are there any supports on the Chromebooks that would support the student's weak area? I want to start with the least restrictive environment first. And if that doesn't meet the student's needs adequately, then I will move on and restrict the student a little bit and maybe add a different device. But I always want to try and stick with the tools that are existing already first, or take a low-tech approach first. Then what I'll do is I'll narrow down the tools that I think might meet the student's needs the best, and I want to establish or create some sort of a trial in order to gather the data. And that's really where your final project is for this course, is you're going to facilitate data collection on two different supports for a student, and you want to pick your unit of analysis. So am I picking spelling quality or spelling accuracy? Am I picking legibility? Am I picking math accuracy or number legibility, or reading comprehension? So I want to pick some sort of a unit of analysis. I want to create a data collection tool. And then I want to figure out, okay, what tools am I outlining for the team, and giving them that particular data collection so they can know how it's working, so we can make a decision together as a team as the most appropriate tool to meet the students' needs. So during this process, when we look throughout the AT assessment, what we might want to be able to do is to establish a baseline for student understanding or student knowledge. And so unlike an educational assessment with a Woodcock-Johnson and some standardized assessments, assistive technology assessments, as we saw in the states in the federal definition, are very flexible depending on student need. So these are formative assessments that could be used during an assessment to establish a baseline of student functioning. So this first one is called the Written Productivity Profile, and the other one is the WOLD. These two writing assessments really establish a baseline of students' ability to handwrite versus type across a variety of tasks. So these assessments try and simulate what sort of writing tasks does a student have to do in a classroom. So sit and think to yourself, what sort of writing tasks does a student need to be able to do? So typically we have note-taking, which is copying from the board, and written expression. So creatively writing your own sentences, your own unique sentences. And so they have a couple of different iterations of those two tasks, but it really is comparing what is the student's speed and accuracy across typing and handwriting. The next one is reading. So this one is the protocols for accommodations in reading. And what this assessment does is it looks at student grade level material, and there's 3 different passages delivered to the student in 3 different ways. The first one, the student reads and is orally asked reading comprehension questions. The second one, an adult reads it, and again, the student is asked questions orally. And the final one, the student listens to it using a text-to-speech support. And the reading comprehension accuracy questions, which are arranged by vocabulary, main idea, inferencing, and factual, are then calculated to see the accuracy. And what we want to see here is, with an accommodation of audiobooks or text-to-speech, is a student's comprehension increased? And then the final 3 assessments are looking at communication. So the first one is a symbol assessment to see, can a student understand symbol relationships and understand that maybe a cup could mean I need a drink. So instead of looking at the action of drink, can they use a symbol and understand function and organize symbols into categories? The next one is the communication matrix, and through a series of interviews and observations, it helps you to establish a baseline of the student's communicative functions. What I like about this is it creates a visual profile that looks very similar to the periodic table of elements, to see the student's current functioning, and then the team can use this as progress to track the student's communication advances, and which is really nice, using assistive technology or without. And then finally, AAC Genie is an app for an iPad that will determine access points for a student. So can a student make a choice in a field of 4 boxes? Can they make a choice in a field of 9, 32, 48? And it'll keep going up to see if the student can accurately access a wide variety of different options. So throughout this course, as we have our writing week, our reading week, and our communication week, we'll dive a little bit further into some of these assessments, but I wanted to give you an overview as you're starting to pick your target student and plan your assistive technology implementation and trial, so that we can start working on that now. So I wanted to introduce these. So this is step 1, an overview of AT assessments.